And that brings us to, by far, the biggest news of the day, which is this whistleblower story, which is now going officially nuts. Now, this story's been percolating since late on Friday night. It really blew up in the 9 o'clock hour last night in the middle of our show when the Washington Post published this sort of headline for the ages. President's communications with foreign leader are part of whistleblower complaint that spurred standoff between spy chief and Congress. President's communications with foreign leader. What's that about? The Post reporting last night that this whistleblower complaint that has been brewing in Washington as a sort of spooky and unplaceable story, Post reporting last night that it was sparked by President Trump's communications with a foreign leader. Quote, Trump's interaction with the foreign leader included a promise that was regarded as so troubling that it prompted an official in the U.S. intelligence community to file a formal whistleblower complaint with the intelligence community's inspector general. So that lands with a gigantic thud last night in the 9 o'clock hour. Since that initial Washington Post reporting 24 hours ago, the main substance of that report has been matched by NBC News, Wall Street Journal, CNN, the New York Times, a whole bunch of other outlets. We still don't know who this whistleblower is or how exactly he or she came to know the alleged contents of President Trump's communication with a foreign leader, including his alleged startling promise. But we do now know that whoever this whistleblower is, he or she has just hired a lawyer, and a real heavyweight lawyer, who is himself ex-Department of Defense and an ex-CIA officer. According to his law firm, he is considered to be one of the nation's leading experts on whistleblower reprisals, meaning people who get attacked, fired, or otherwise punished for legally whistleblowing on alleged misbehavior in government. This lawyer apparently created the program inside the CIA to investigate and prevent reprisals against whistleblowers inside that agency. So we don't know if this unknown whistleblower retained this heavyweight lawyer before or after the whistleblower filed his or her complaint on August 12th, but it seems like picking up this lawyer might have been a prudent thing to do. Because what has emerged over the course of the past 24 hours, astonishingly, is that the Trump administration at multiple levels appears to be handling this whistleblower complaint in such a way that they may be basically threatening prosecution of this whistleblower for coming forward with whatever this disturbing information is about President Trump's alleged behavior. Now, the complaint at least appears to be getting treated here as if it is outside the bounds of the law that protects whistleblowers, the law that protects whistleblowers from, among other things, being prosecuted for bringing forward sensitive information like this through the appropriate channels. Now, why would that be? It has emerged over the past 24 hours that the Justice Department, led by William Barr, for some reason, they have been brought into this process. They're not supposed to be within the whistleblower process, but the Justice Department has now been brought into this, and it appears that they have provided some sort of legal argument, which nobody has seen, but the legal argument is reportedly that this complaint, this whistleblower complaint, isn't a real whistleblower complaint, and shouldn't be treated this way. This whistleblower should not be treated as a real whistleblower who is protected by the law. And therefore, this whistleblower complaint doesn't need to be handed over to Congress. That appears to be the legal analysis provided here by the Justice Department under William Barr. Nobody knows why they were even consulted, but this is apparently how they have inserted themselves into the process. Now, CNN is reporting today that in addition to the Justice Department getting involved here, the Trump White House has been directly involved in the handling of this complaint, which, if you think about it, is bizarre, right? Here's CNN's reporting, quote, the White House and Justice Department advised the Director of National Intelligence that the complaint involving President Trump is not governed by laws covering intelligence whistleblowers. So it seems clear from multiple sources, including Congress, that this is the advice that William Barr and the Justice Department have provided on this issue. But CNN's reporting that it's also advice the White House is providing as well. I mean, think about that for a second. The fact that the White House was consulted on this at all? This is a whistleblower complaint about allegedly very troubling behavior by the highest-ranking occupant of the White House. So you bring that complaint to the White House to ask how you should handle it? I mean, that itself is a complete deviation from how whistleblowers' complaints are supposed to be handled. You're not supposed to go to the subject of the complaint, the person about whom the complaint has been registered, and ask them how they think this matter should be taken up. If this matter was in fact brought to the White House, has this whistleblower's identity been protected, even to the White House? But that's apparently how the Trump administration is handling this matter. After the intelligence community's Inspector General, Michael Atkinson, met behind closed doors with the House Intelligence Committee for hours today, the chairman of that committee, Adam Schiff, raised the prospect publicly that not only is this unknown whistleblower potentially at risk of being retaliated against now and potentially even prosecuted by William Barr, but the Inspector General who received the complaint might also be at risk here from the Trump administration and their reprisals.
And the Inspector General is doing his very best to be very careful that he follow the law. And in some respects, the Inspector General is in the same position of the whistleblower, which is if the Inspector General steps 1 foot outside of what he's authorized to do, then he is not protected. And so this shows how someone is trying to manipulate the system to keep information about an urgent matter from the Congress.
Whether or not the Inspector General himself is at risk of being prosecuted by William Barr for the crime of receiving this whistleblower complaint about the president's behavior, the Inspector General appears to be doing everything he can under the law to try to make sure that this complaint is actually investigated and that it is actually handed over to the intelligence committees in Congress, which are supposed to have oversight over things like this and which are specifically supposed to receive whistleblower complaints without any interference from the subject of the complaint. The Intelligence Committee today released a letter today from the Inspector General in which the Inspector General says that he considers himself to be bound by the administration's decisions, but he respectfully disagrees with their determination that this complaint doesn't have to be handed over. He said, quote, "The complainant's disclosure not only falls within the DNI's jurisdiction, but it relates to one of the most significant and important of the DNI's responsibilities to the American people." He also complained that while the backstop here is supposed to be that the whistleblower, him or herself, should be allowed to convey their complaint directly to Congress through secure and legal channels that are made available to them for this purpose, the Trump administration appears to be blocking the whistleblower from doing that as well. The Inspector General also says that he asked for permission to at least convey the general subject of the complaint to the intelligence committees today, and he was denied permission to do so. So the Inspector General got this complaint, has tried to do the right thing with it. This Inspector General who looked into it found it credible, found it to be urgent, found it to be something that needed to be investigated, that needed to be handed over to Congress. He is now in this anguished position, saying that what the Trump administration is doing here is blocking him from protecting this whistleblower, which he is legally obligated to do. The Trump administration is also blocking him from making sure that this serious and properly conveyed complaint is delivered to Congress. It's his statutory responsibility to ensure that, and they're blocking him from doing it. So he is absolutely stuck. And Congressman Schiff is signaling that that Inspector General might himself find himself prosecuted or retaliated against just for receiving this complaint and trying to do the right thing under law with this matter. Congressman Adam Schiff is going to be joining us live in just a moment. We still, of course, do not know what the complaint itself is. But I have to tell you, the Washington Post just moments ago posted the next big development in this story. This is a story from the Washington Post, which is just posted. It cites two sources in saying that the whistleblower's complaint about President Trump involves the nation of Ukraine. There's been a bunch of speculation about this over the course of the last 24 hours, in part just because of the timeline here. And I don't mean to be weird. This is going to sound weird, but don't take it that way. If you have been watching this show over the past few weeks, you are probably better equipped to understand what's going on here, this latest version of this story. You are probably better equipped to understand what's going on here than your friends who have better things to do at 9 p.m. Eastern on a weeknight. So this story, this part of the story and this new development that this complaint about President Trump may involve the nation of Ukraine, this ought to ring a bunch of bells for you because we've been covering this pretty intensively. 2 weeks ago, on September 5th, the Washington Post ran this on the editorial page. And even though it was on the editorial page, it contained this remarkable claim. You see the headline there, quote, "Trump tries to force Ukraine to meddle in the 2020 election," meaning the 2020 U.S. election, explaining that the newly elected president of Ukraine appears to be a real reformer and a real small d Democrat, and that therefore ought to be a cause for celebration in Washington. The Post argues that nevertheless, the new Ukrainian president has received the cold shoulder from the Trump administration. He, quote, "has so far failed to win the backing of President Trump. Not only has Trump refused to grant the Ukrainian leader a White House visit, he's also suspended the delivery of $250 million in U.S. military aid to this country that is still fighting Russian aggression in its eastern provinces. Some suspect Mr. Trump is once again catering to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who, of course, is dedicated to undermining Ukrainian democracy and independence. But, the Post says, we're reliably told that the president has a second and more venal agenda. He's attempting to force the Ukrainian president to intervene in the 2020 U.S. presidential election by launching an investigation in Ukraine of the leading Democratic candidate, Joe Biden. Mr. Trump is not just soliciting Ukraine's help with his presidential re-election campaign, he's using U.S. military aid that country desperately needs in an attempt to extort it. So, again, we still do not know if that is exactly what this whistleblower complaint is about that is currently blowing up proverbial Washington. Shane Harris in the Washington Post tonight is reporting that the whistleblower complaint has something to do with Ukraine. But the timeline here may be instructive. This is what we know of the timeline. President Trump has a phone call with the new president of Ukraine July 25th. 3 days later, the director of national intelligence, Dan Coats, is out. He submits his resignation. Less than 2 weeks later, there's a strange incident in the White House, first reported by CNN, in which that outgoing director of national intelligence, Dan Coats, for some reason, steps into a meeting that's being led by his deputy, Sue Gordon. And he tells her in the middle of that meeting, in front of a bunch of other people, "Hey, Sue, you need to resign." And Sue Gordon, in fact, submits her resignation that day. 4 days later, the whistleblower complaint is filed with the intelligence community's inspector general. 3 days after that, Dan Coats and Sue Gordon leave the White House. Before that week is out, President Trump says publicly that whatever Russia did to Ukraine to get themselves kicked out of the G8, that should basically be forgiven. Russia and Vladimir Putin should be let back into the G8. Before the next week is out, Politico is first to report that Trump has put on hold $250 million in military aid to Ukraine, money that was appropriated by the Congress to help Ukraine stand up to Russia. Before the next week is out, the White House announces that it is cutting almost the entire military construction budget in Eastern Europe that is specifically designated to help other nations on Russia's border stand up themselves against Russian aggression of the type faced by Ukraine. 2 days after that, the Washington Post publishes its op-ed about Trump allegedly demanding help from Ukraine for his re-election effort and threatening to deny Ukraine U.S. military assistance unless and until he gets it. And now there's a new acting director of national intelligence that isn't letting the whistleblower complaint that's reportedly about Ukraine be forwarded to the intelligence committees, which they are legally required to do. Somewhere out there right now in America is a whistleblower from the intelligence community who has gone through channels and done things by the book and sought whistleblower protection under law to alert Congress in good faith about a serious and urgent matter that reportedly involves the president, his communications with foreign leaders, some sort of promise that he has made to foreign leaders, and potentially some shenanigans involving the nation of Ukraine. Bit by bit, the substance of the complaint seems to be coming to the surface, while hour by hour, the Trump administration appears to be fixing its crosshairs on the whistleblower and on anybody who helps him or her make this story known. At a fundamental level, this is repulsive in terms of how whistleblowers are supposed to be treated in our country or in any. But this is also ongoing. This is live. It's happening right now. Shane Harris joins us next. Congressman Adam Schiff will be with us in just a moment. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.